Eleanor stood in the bowels of the mill, her lungs burning from the scalding steam hissing through the darkness. Her hands were slick with grease and her own blood as she stared at the glowing monitor of the town server. On the screen, a forged confession bearing her digital signature was already broadcasting to the police, framing her for the theft of the town's entire pension fund. Behind her, the man she had trusted since childhood held a heavy iron wrench, his face twisted into a mask she no longer recognized. "It's not just a debt, Eleanor," he whispered over the roar of the sabotaged boiler. "It's an execution." Outside, the cheerful bluegrass music of the Cotton Festival mocked her, drowned out only by the rhythmic thud of the wrecking ball arriving an hour early. She was trapped in a basement scheduled for demolition, her reputation already murdered, and the only person who could save her was the one currently trying to bury her in the rubble. As the pressure gauge on the main turbine spiked into the red, Eleanor realized the enemy wasn't the conglomerate at the gates. It was the ghost sitting at her father's desk. The fuse was lit, the police were at the door, and she had exactly 60 minutes to prove she wasn't the monster the world now believed her to be. The loom's rhythmic clatter vibrated through Eleanor's bones, each metallic thunk of the shuttle a hammer against her skull. She stood alone in the cavernous heart of the Whitfield mill, the air thick with the ghosts of 100 years of industry. Between her calloused fingers, she pressed a ruined bolt of her experimental organic weave. Once, it had been a promise of silk-soft resilience, a sustainable future for a town dying at the edges. Now, it was a brittle husk, the fibers frayed into dust at the first high-speed pass. Her stomach twisted as the sour scent of scorched almonds and spoiled milk rose from the fabric. 3 months of trials, 2 investor meetings, and a factory floor humming with skepticism had led to this. A pile of gray, useless lint. This failure felt like more than a technical glitch. It felt like the first crack in a dam she had been holding back with her bare hands. A shadow fell across her boots, heavy and familiar. "Whitfield." She didn't turn. The foreman's voice carried the weight of bad news, the kind that settled in the chest like a stone. "The die batch for the Harris order, it's gone wrong. Turned the whole lot into sludge." Eleanor exhaled through her nose, slow and deliberate, while the loom's mechanical roar swallowed the sound. But the foreman wasn't finished. He shifted his weight, the soles of his heavy work boots squeaking against the oil-slicked concrete. "And the turbine, Eleanor. The main drive. Someone's been at it. It's not just a breakdown. The gears are sheared clean off. Someone put a crowbar in the works while the night shift was on break." The air in the mill felt thicker suddenly, clogged with the acrid tang of hot metal and the cold sweat prickling her spine. Sabotage. The word tasted like copper in her mouth. She dropped the ruined bolt onto the conveyor belt, where it landed with a sound like a sigh. This wasn't just a streak of bad luck. It was a hunting party, and she was the quarry. "Get me the logs," she commanded, her voice low and precise, cutting through the industrial din. But before the foreman could move, a messenger from the administrative office scurried toward them, waving a thick, cream-colored envelope. The sight of the bank's seal made Eleanor's pulse thrum against her collarbone. She tore it open with a jagged motion. The words blurred before her eyes, then snapped into sharp, cruel focus. Foreclosure. The bank intended to seize the property by dawn. They cited the recent production failures and the mounting debt she had inherited from her father's final, desperate years. She had less than 12 hours to stabilize the operations, to prove the mill was still a viable heart for Athens, or the gates would be chained forever. "I need a wrench," Eleanor muttered, more to herself than the men standing paralyzed beside her. She didn't wait for a response. She strode toward the malfunctioning control panel of the turbine, her boots striking the floorboards with a purpose that bordered on violence. She ignored the heat radiating from the iron casing and began bypass wiring the damaged circuits. Her fingers moved with a frantic, geometric precision, stripping wires and rerouting power to prevent the massive machines from seizing permanently. If the looms stopped now, the cooling oil would settle, the threads would snap, and the mill would become a graveyard. She was wrestling with a dying beast, her hands smeared with grease, and her mind calculating the exact tension needed to keep the pulse of the factory alive. The heavy steel doors at the far end of the floor groaned open, admitting a gust of humid Georgia air and a man who moved like he owned the sunlight. Marcus Tate rushed toward her, his tailored suit a jarring contrast to the grime of the factory floor. He looked breathless, his dark hair slicked back with too much pomade, his eyes wide with a practiced sort of panic. "Eleanor, stop!" he shouted, waving a leather-bound folder. "It's over. I just got off the phone with Atlanta. The conglomerate. They've made a move. A hostile takeover bid, effective immediately. They're offering to buy out the debt, but they want you out of the chair by morning." Eleanor didn't look up from the sparking wires. "They want the land, Marcus. They don't want the mill. They'll raze this place and build condos before the dust even settles. It's a graceful exit." Marcus countered, stepping closer, his scent of expensive cologne clashing with the smell of machine oil. "Look at the ledgers, Eleanor. We're hemorrhaging. Your organic dream is a sinkhole. We take the deal, we walk away with our skins." She finally stood, wiping her hands on a rag that did little to remove the black grease. "I'm not walking away from my father's legacy because some suit in Atlanta wants a tax write-off." They retreated to the administrative loft, a cramped L-shaped space perched above the floor like a watchtower. The argument escalated, their voices bouncing off the peeling floral wallpaper. Eleanor slammed a ledger onto the oak desk, the same desk where her father had sat the night he died. "The numbers don't add up, Marcus. We had the Harris deposit. We had the state grant. Where did the liquidity go?" Marcus's jaw tightened, a tell she had known since they were children playing in the rafters. "Market volatility, Eleanor. Shipping costs. You wouldn't understand the fiscal side. You're too busy playing mechanic." The shouting was cut short by a sound that didn't belong in a textile mill. The sharp, discordant shatter of safety glass. Eleanor lunged for the window overlooking the loading dock. Below, a group of men in dark clothes and bandanas were battering their way through the secondary entrance. They weren't there to steal. They carried sledgehammers and cans of industrial solvent. They were targeting the prototypes, the only evidence she had that her organic weave could actually work. "Marcus, call the police," Eleanor yelled, already halfway down the rickety metal stairs. "Eleanor, wait! It's too dangerous!" Marcus shouted after her, but he didn't move toward the phone. She hit the factory floor at a dead run. The agitators were already among the looms, swinging hammers at the delicate heddles and pouring foul-smelling liquid over the finished bolts. Rage, cold and sharp as a shuttle needle, pierced through her fear. She didn't have a weapon, but her hand found a heavy brass shuttle tool resting on a workbench. It was a foot of solid metal, balanced and lethal in the right hands. She didn't announce herself. She swung. The brass tool connected with the shoulder of a man dousing a loom in solvent, the impact vibrating up her arm. He grunted and spun, a masked thug with eyes that flickered with surprise before hardening into violence. He lunged at her, his hands reaching for her throat. Eleanor stepped back, her boots finding traction on the slick floor, and used his momentum to shove him toward the spinning frames. The proximity to the moving drive belts made him flinch, and she used that second of hesitation to strike again, this time catching him in the ribs. The struggle was a blur of shadows and the smell of ozone. She was smaller, but she knew the geography of this place. The hidden snags, the low beams, the places where the floor dipped. She fought like a woman possessed, fending off a second attacker with a spray of pressurized air from a nearby hose. The intruders, realizing this wasn't the easy demolition job they'd been promised, began to retreat toward the loading dock as the last of them scrambled out into the night. Eleanor leaned against a support beam, her chest heaving, her knuckles bleeding. Something caught the light near the feet of the man she'd first struck. A small, black object. She knelt and picked it up. An encrypted flash drive. She retreated to the office, locking the door behind her. Her hands were shaking as she slotted the drive into the ancient computer. The screen flickered to life, demanding a password. She tried everything. The mill's founding date, her father's name, the conglomerate's ticker symbol. Nothing. Then, a memory surfaced. A summer afternoon 30 years ago, hiding in the basement with Marcus, sharing a secret code they'd used to lock their childhood treasure chest. Bluebird 84. The drive clicked. The directories opened. Eleanor felt the world tilt on its axis. The files weren't from an Atlanta conglomerate. They were personal accounts, digital receipts for gambling debts. And there, in a folder marked Sabotage, were the schematics for the turbine she had just spent an hour trying to fix. The password hadn't been a corporate code. It was a ghost from her own past. The betrayal didn't come from the city. It was sitting in the office next door. Marcus hadn't been trying to save her. He had been the one holding the knife. The realization was a physical blow, leaving her breathless in the stale air of the loft. She began to dig deeper, her fingers flying across the keys as she bypassed the surface-level accounting. The discrepancies weren't just market volatility. Marcus had been systematically draining the workers' pension fund for months, funneling the money into offshore accounts to cover his losses at the underground tables in Atlanta. This wasn't a business failure, it was a harvest. He was stripping the mill of its last drop of blood before the bank could even get to the door. She glanced at the clock on the wall. 1 a.m. The state authorities, alerted by the bank's foreclosure filing, would be here in exactly 5 hours to freeze every asset and lock the doors for good. If she couldn't trace the stolen funds and prove the embezzlement before they arrived, the workers would lose everything. Not just their jobs, but the retirement they had bled for over 40 years. Eleanor stood, her spine straightening with a grim, new resolve. She had to get to the main server in the basement to pull the full transaction history. She reached for the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. She rattled it, then threw her shoulder against the heavy oak. Locked, from the outside. "Marcus," she screamed, though she knew he wouldn't answer. She grabbed the desk phone, but the line was a hollow, dead void. He had severed the physical wires. She was trapped in her father's office, a glass-walled cage overlooking the silent machines. A soft scrape sounded from the ceiling, the maintenance hatch. A man dropped down, landing with the silent grace of a predator. He wore the gray uniform of the mill's night security, but Eleanor didn't recognize his face. He was too polished, his movements too controlled. He didn't look like a man who spent his nights punching a clock. He looked like a man who spent them cleaning up messes. "Miss Whitfield," he said, his voice a smooth, practiced murmur. "Mr. Tate is concerned about your health. You've had a very stressful night. I'm here to help you rest." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, glinting object, a syringe. The amber fluid inside caught the harsh light of the bare bulb. Eleanor didn't wait for him to explain. She lunged across the desk, sending a stack of ledgers flying. She wasn't a fighter, but she was a woman who had spent 20 years wrestling with iron and wood. She grabbed a heavy, leather-bound ledger, a century of Whitfield history, and swung it with every ounce of her desperation. The corner of the book caught the guard across the temple just as he lunged. He went down hard, his head striking the edge of the oak desk with a sickening crack. The syringe skittered across the carpet, harmlessly discharging its venom into the fibers. Eleanor stood over him, her breath coming in jagged gasps, the ledger still clutched in her hand like a shield. She knelt and searched his pockets, her fingers trembling. No ID, no badge. But tucked into his vest was a folded piece of parchment. It wasn't a corporate contract. It was a personal service agreement, a debt collection waiver signed by Marcus Tate. The creditors weren't banks, they were sharks. Marcus hadn't just gambled his own money. He had used the mill, the land, the machines, the very air they breathed, as collateral for his addiction. The hostile takeover was a fiction, a smokescreen to keep her distracted while he finalized the liquidation of the property. Eleanor returned to the computer, her mind racing. She bypassed a secondary firewall, her eyes scanning lines of code until she found the secret deed transfer. Marcus had already signed away the land. The mill was scheduled for demolition to make way for a private development project that would pay off his debts and leave him with a tidy profit. While the town of Athens was left with a hole in its heart. A distant sound drifted through the cracked window, the upbeat, mocking notes of a fiddle. The Cotton Festival. The town was waking up to celebrate a heritage that Marcus was currently selling for scrap. The streets would be clogged with tourists and parade floats, making it impossible for her to get to the sheriff's office or find a way out through the main gates. She gathered the flash drive, the debt contract, and the printouts of the pension theft. She couldn't stay here. The guard would wake up, or Marcus would return to finish what he started. She looked at the office window. It was a 20-foot drop to the loading dock, but there was a rusted drain pipe within reach. One problem at a time, she whispered, the mantra of her father. She kicked out the glass, the shards falling like diamonds into the dark, and climbed out into the humid night. The bluegrass music grew louder as she descended, a cheerful soundtrack to her ruin. She hit the ground and ducked behind a stack of rotted pallets. The festival grounds were barely a block away, the bright lights of the Ferris wheel casting long, rotating shadows across the mill's brick facade. She needed to reach the town's central server room, but she was a fugitive in her own factory. Marcus was there, waiting for her on the factory floor. He wasn't hiding anymore. He stood by the main boiler, his shadow cast long and distorted by the flickering pilot light. He held a heavy iron wrench, and his face was a mask of cold, aristocratic disdain. "You always were too stubborn for your own good, Eleanor," he said, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. "You could have taken the buyout. You could have moved to Savannah, opened a little boutique, lived a quiet life. But you had to dig. You stole their lives, Marcus," Eleanor said, her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart. "The pension fund, the land. My father trusted you." Marcus laughed, a dry, rattling sound. "Your father was a fool who died for a pile of bricks. And now, so will you. I've bypassed the safety valves on the boiler. In 20 minutes, this place becomes an insurance claim. A tragic accident during the festival. A grieving daughter, a faulty machine. The narrative writes itself." He lunged at her, the wrench whistling through the air. Eleanor dodged, the metal striking a steam pipe with a deafening clang. The basement was already filling with white, scalding mist. They grappled amidst the hissing machinery, a brutal, clumsy struggle for survival. Marcus was stronger, his hands pinning her against a vibrating pipe that burned through her shirt. But Eleanor knew the boiler's anatomy better than her own. She reached out, her fingers screaming with the heat, and found the primary pressure release valve, the one Marcus had forgotten to chain. With a scream of effort, she wrenched it shut. The high-pitched whistle of the steam died instantly, the building's shuddering vibration settling into a low hum. Marcus snarled and struck her across the face. Eleanor hit the concrete, the world spinning into gray. He stood over her, breathing hard. "It doesn't matter, Eleanor. I've already uploaded your confession to the town server. The embezzlement, the sabotage, it's all linked to your private IP. The police are outside right now. They aren't here to save you. They're here to arrest you." He looked at his watch and smiled. "And the demolition crews? They're on a timer. 60 minutes, Eleanor. Whether the boiler blows or not, this place is coming down." He turned and vanished into the steam, leaving her dazed on the floor. Eleanor crawled toward a basement vent. Outside, she could see the flashing lights of the Athens police cruisers cutting through the festival crowds. They were moving toward the mill entrance, warrants in hand. She was trapped in a doomed building, framed for the destruction of her own life's work. "The soul," she gasped, pushing herself up. He said he destroyed the soul. She remembered his last taunt. He had sold the historic heirloom looms, the ones her great-grandfather had built, for scrap metal. They were already gone, hauled away under the cover of the festival's noise. Her eyes fell on a rusted panel near the floor, the entrance to the ancient pneumatic tube system. As a child, she and Marcus had sent messages through these brass veins, navigating the secret map of the mill. The police would expect her to use the doors or the windows. They wouldn't expect her to become a ghost in the walls. She squeezed into the narrow, soot-choked crawl space, just as the heavy boots of the officers hammered on the floorboards above. The dust was suffocating, the space so tight her ribs ached with every breath. But she moved with a desperate, ancestral memory. She navigated the dark, bypass wiring her fear, until she reached the junction that led under the street toward the festival's main stage. She emerged into the service hatch of the control booth, covered in grime and cobwebs. The sound technician was gone, likely grabbing a beer during the bluegrass intermission. The master audio console glowed with 100 amber lights. Eleanor pulled the flash drive from her pocket. She didn't just have the theft records. She had the recording from the boiler room. The digital mic on her phone had been running the whole time. On the stage outside, Marcus was stepping up to the microphone. He looked the part of the grieving partner, his head bowed as he addressed the gathered townspeople. "It is with a heavy heart," his voice boomed over the speakers, "that I must tell you Eleanor Whitfield has fled. She has taken the pension funds, the future of our families." Eleanor's fingers danced over the console. She patched her device into the main override. "The narrative," she whispered, "is changing." She hit play. Marcus's voice, cold and mocking, drowned out his live performance. "I've already uploaded your confession, the insurance payout. Your father was a fool." The silence that fell over the Cotton Festival was more deafening than any loom. Marcus froze, his face turning the color of ash as his own words echoed off the brick buildings of downtown Athens. From the side of the stage, the boutique investor Eleanor had met weeks ago stepped into the light. He didn't look like an investor anymore. He held a badge. Federal Bureau of Investigation. "Marcus Tate, you're under arrest for interstate gambling fraud and embezzlement." The townspeople, the men and women who had worked the looms for generations, didn't wait for the police. They surged forward, a human wall of denim and flannel, blocking Marcus's path as he tried to bolt. Eleanor stepped out of the control booth, the morning sun finally breaking over the horizon. She handed the flash drive and the debt contracts to the agent. The demolition was halted. The foreclosure stayed by federal intervention. An hour later, as the first light of a new day hit the factory floor, Eleanor stood among her workers. They weren't there to pick up their final checks. They were there with pens in hand, signing the papers that would turn the Whitfield mill into a worker-owned cooperative. She watched as the foreman flipped the main switch. The turbine groaned, then caught, a steady, powerful heartbeat. The looms roared back to life, and for the first time in months, the thread held. The organic weave, resilient and soft, began to flow. Eleanor pressed her hand against the vibrating iron of the frame, feeling the past and the future finally align. The fortune was gone, but the soul of Athens was still weaving.